Alright guys, welcome back to the Engineered Lifestyle with Alejandro Mendoza. Today, I'm actually going to be responding to a comment from someone who has contributed a lot to the channel already, so thank you very much. And I hope that you find this helpful. And I'm not a pro at using the GoPro. That was terrible, probably reshoot that. But I think I do have some helpful hits, and I have some great setting recommendations for you today. So let's get into it. Alright, so I shoot on the GoPro Hero 8. This thing is awesome in terms of its capabilities. The different lens modes are great. Between the super view and the linear, you do have quite a bit of freedom to select your desired field of view, and that actually comes into play when you are using different mounting points, and the mounting points of course are very critical. So speaking of mounting points, on the motorcycle I used a couple. There is a good mounting point that I have on the end of the handlebar actually that seems a little precarious, but with the mount that I'm using I trust it. Of course I use a handlebar mount just like everyone does, and I also use a mount on the peg, passenger peg, and this actually gives you that cool view of both the chain when you're facing back or the brake, and also the kind of the rider's triangle, just your leg and even your arms in super view. And by using the ND filters, you're actually able to blur that motion. So when you're going even slow speeds like 30 miles per hour, if you use the correct ND filter and you have the 180 degree rule applied in your settings, you actually get this beautiful blur. And that foreground blur, especially in the brake caliber shots, is what I really love and what looks cinematic. Before I get into those settings, we're going to talk a little bit more about mounting. Initially, I was mounting with a clamp like this. So this clamp here is actually very robust. I'm super happy with it. It's got quite the grip strength. However, the problem with this is actually that the mount here facilitates this arm, which is fine for a static setting. This thing is, think like a gorilla pod. So when you do clamp this and when you get the vibrations of the motorcycle with your GoPro here at the end, it's obviously not all that stable in terms of the actual image. The stability of the mount is good, but it's very clear that there's just minor deflections like this that unfortunately make it very difficult to achieve a good image, especially using the settings that I'm using. So I went from using this to using actually a ball joint mount. So here, I'll show you guys that. This thing, it looks pretty legit, but actually is quite affordable, and it is highly flexible. So this thing is critical to really setting up some good angles, especially if you don't have the 9 or 10, because you don't have that horizon leveling. So before, I would use a hard mount like this, and obviously we have very defined coordinates. It's quite difficult to get a level image, especially with the off angles of your mounting locations, and that is something that you can't really compensate for, unfortunately, without adding more and more of these connections. And these connections obviously then compound into a less stable image. Alright, so another mount I use is actually the suction cup mount. Obviously, this is perfect for attaching to cars, or really just flat surfaces, stuff like glass. But this one's super old. I actually got it when I got my Hero 2 back in high school. So another major detriment is the aforementioned connection points, and these really, if you don't have the 9 or 10, make it difficult to get a level image. That is something that I have counteracted previously with just a lot of adjustment, and I actually have on order a suction cup mount that incorporates this ball design, and this will actually really open up the flexibility for mounting points, and it's something that I really hope to leverage in upcoming videos. So another thing you'll notice is that I do not use a case on the GoPro. And that is for a couple reasons. One, because I'm a daredevil, and two, because I have found that the plastic in front of the lens ends up giving you some distortion. Sometimes you can actually leverage this in your favor to make it look like flaring, and I'll put some examples up here, but often, especially in very bright environments, you can get like a ghosting effect, and that is frustrating to work with because the GoPro is very capable of a clear image with enough light. Okay, we're going to pause here very quickly. I'm just going to say please drop a like if you're finding value in this thus far, because of the engagement that you have provided with the likes, with the comments. My videos have actually been pushed out to over 20,000 people just in the last couple weeks alone, so thank you so much for that. That is awesome. And the channel has grown rapidly, so I would love to keep adding to our community and producing videos for you guys. Alright, let's get back to it. You may have bought a GoPro in the past because it has a higher frame rate and is thus more capable in the slow motion settings, but that is not conducive to getting a degree of blur in your image, and that is what I find to be cinematic looking. That is typically what you see in films. No, I'm not making films, but I do like the look of a good motion blur. So in order to do so, you have to use the 180 rule, which, if you don't know, means that your shutter speed has to be twice that of your frame rate. And so if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, which is standard, you'd be shooting at 1/48 on your shutter. And what that will do is it will give very quick motion the opportunity to blur. So you see I'm shooting in 24 right now, is my hand will appear blurry and not. So the problem with high frame rates is you do actually have that clarity where if you look closely, you'll start to see the images and you won't have this this blur here. If you can see here, we're looking at both the wheel and the ground is very nicely blurred, and that is the result of adhering to that 180 rule. So in this image, I actually have the GoPro set up exactly as I do now. The problem that you face with using ND filters is actually when you start facing them towards your light source, and perhaps you set up your shot to not face that direction, or you start facing them into shadows. So in order to properly use the ND filter, what you're going to want to do is really consider the environment in which you're shooting. And I have failed at this within videos that I've actually posted to the channel, and that is just the result of a changing environment. That's just something that you're going to face with shooting on a motorcycle or a car, is you are eventually going to face the sun, or you're going to face into the shadows away from the sun, and your ND filter will then underexpose or overexpose your image. So going further into those settings, I want to talk a little bit about ISO, and how that's related is you are putting a neutral density filter on. What that does is it darkens your image, which allows you to drag shutter. So say I want to shoot in 24 frames per second, but I'm in a very bright environment. I'm shooting straight into the light here, as you see. Well, in order to achieve 24 frames per second, what I need to do is then add ND. However, if this is too much ND, then the camera will then, if it is in auto ISO, shoot up the ISO, and that's where you get this graininess, this green-red grain that just looks terrible, and unfortunately, it's inherent to the sensor size of these smaller cameras. Your ISO, you need to cap. That is the only way to avoid that grain, is to cap it. I have an ISO max of 1600. That's still kind of high, but that will try to eliminate some of that graininess. It doesn't always succeed. I'll put an example of that right here. But apart from that, some of the other settings that are critical to use in order to achieve good cinematic shot is you need a high bit rate. What this will do is it will give you more information to manipulate in post-production in terms of color. Something else to consider is your white balance. You can really throw off your colors, and it is frustrating to deal with when you're actually processing the video if you have your white balance cranked all the way up or all the way down. So what I do is I actually just use the native white balance. Apart from that, if you are actually going through and post-processing these to post or share with family, you're actually going to want to shoot in flat color. And that is just a decision to really lower the contrast of your image so that you can then stylize it with whatever software it is you're using. I'm actually just using an iPad. I'm using LumaFusion, and I do have my gripes with that software, but I am able to manipulate to get the color that I want, typically just as long as I keep it in flat and a native white balance. Apart from that, one other critical thing to consider is GoPros usually over-sharpen their image, and that is a problem because that is something, especially with cheap software, with consumer-grade stuff that I'm using, like, it is nearly impossible to fix. You can always add sharpness, but you cannot take it away. That is why I keep my sharpness in the low setting. So the last thing that I consider is really the mounting location, and that really dictates my lens choice. So when I have the camera over on the end of my handlebar, that is something, because the camera is very close to me, that I need to leverage the super view mode for. And though it does distort, as you can see kind of in this image, if you look at my arm and my head, like, obviously those dimensions are just wrong. However, with the motion, with the blur, with the lighting, a small detail like that can go largely unignored. I typically stay in super view or wide, and that is because my very final tip is completely counterintuitive to this platform, and that is, do not use a stabilization. Just don't. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're going to be using ND filters and you're trying to get a cinematic shot, you are going to be completely unable to use stabilization. And before you get frustrated and click off the video and just tell me that I'm an idiot for suggesting this, hear me out. The wider your field of view, the less shake that is perceptible, because what it does is it's going to minimize your subject. What appears further away will appear less shaky. And so the problem is GoPro uses some computational stabilization in that it is examining the previous frame to the current frame. And by doing that frame after frame after frame after frame, many times a second, it is actually able to align the subject and then make it appear as though the frame is steady. This is awesome, and they do it super well, but what that dictates is that analysis of each of the frames is unimpeded by something like an ND filter. So when you throw an ND filter on and keep stabilization on, you're going to very quickly realize that there's just really something wrong. It doesn't behave as it would if you have the ND filter off, in that it's not actually stabilizing, it's kind of shaking it more. Sorry guys, that's my dog. Where was I? Stabilization, ND filters, it just doesn't work, guys. You're going to get shaking, it's going to be frustrating, and you're going to be wondering why you paid extra for a filter that makes your footage look like crap. So make sure that you keep stabilization off when trying to get that cinematic shot. And though that does seem counterintuitive, trust me, it works out. Most of the footage, actually I think all of the footage that I've shown thus far on GoPro has not been stabilized. You don't really recognize it, just as long as you're using that super view or the wide view. Another tip for you guys here, I know this is a lot of information, but I actually include all of the equipment that I use in the description of all my videos. Those are affiliate links. I make a very small percentage if you do choose to buy the product after you click those, and that just goes back into the channel. And thus far I think I've made like $10, so thank you very much, that is amazing. But I will never include links to something that I do not actually use. As you notice, you will not find any ND filters for a 9 or a 10, and that is just because I do not own that piece of equipment. I really hope that you guys find value in this, and I just wanted to reiterate my thanks. I really appreciate the engagement on the channel, and keep the comments coming in, because I will shoot videos like these in response to questions. And cheers to the New Year's, guys. Thanks. I don't know where I'm going with that. Anyway, okay, so another mount I use is actually the I have 3% battery. Let me know if you'd like. Oh my god.